The machine is vast. Its shadow devours the battlefield before a single weapon is fired, and its footsteps echo like judgment itself. To serve within such a god engine is to surrender everything, your name, your breath, your very humanity, and become one small cog inside a furnace of endless war. Yet those who enter do not imagine glory as you or I might. They imagine survival inside the lungs of a titan, where steel groans like the voice of an ancient god and the stink of promethium clings to the skin, as though it has seeped into the marrow. This is not command. This is not freedom. This is imprisonment inside the belly of a beast that will never die so long as its masters feed it with flesh, faith, and fire. If you are drawn into these halls of thunder and want to walk deeper with us into the brutal lives of those who serve within a titan, lend your support. The oath was whispered in darkness, though the words were not his own. He had been dragged blindfolded into the echoing vaults beneath the forge, the air so thick with incense that every breath burned. Around him, unseen voices rose and fell in Dinharic cant, the rhythm of syllables sounding less like prayer and more like the calibration of a machine. He was made to kneel, and the cold press of steel kissed the back of his neck as a brand was driven into flesh. He did not scream, not because he was brave, but because screaming was not permitted. Those who had screamed before him had vanished into silence that no one dared explain. When the blindfold was torn away, the world that greeted him was not of men, but of engines. The chamber glowed with the pulse of reactors, and the floor was slick with sacred oils. Hooded adepts of the mechanicus moved like insects, their mechadendrites swaying as they traced sigils of circuitry across bare skin. Each mark was a bond, each word an unbreakable command. They called him nothing now, for names were shed like rotting cloth. He had been broken down to ash, stripped of family, stripped of history, and reforged only to serve the titan that awaited him. They did not ask for loyalty. They demanded it, carving obedience into sinew and marrow until the body remembered what the soul might one day try to forget. Some recruits fainted during the rites, their bodies unable to endure the stench of burning incense and promethium mingled with their own scorched flesh. Those who collapsed were not tended with kindness. Servitors dragged them aside, lifeless or half alive, and no one spoke their fate aloud. The survivors looked on, hollow-eyed, understanding that weakness was the one thing the god machine would never forgive. To serve within it required endurance, not of spirit but of machinery, an ability to keep moving even when the veins boiled and the lungs rattled. When at last he was taken deeper into the vaults, he saw the titan for the first time. It was not the triumphant colossus he had imagined from hushed stories told in childhood. There was no golden glory, no majesty. The machine loomed in silence, its colossal frame caged within scaffolds of iron and draped in cables thicker than a man's torso. It looked less like a god and more like a corpse being readied for resurrection. Its armor plates were scorched, its weapons dormant, its eyes black and cold, yet the air around it thrummed with pressure, as though it might at any moment exhale and crush every living thing beneath its shadow. The initiation was not complete with a brand or an oath. No, the true baptism came when the acolytes were led inside, swallowed by the titan's belly. The first step across its threshold was a threshold across existence itself. Gone were the natural sense of the world, no earth, no rain, no wind. Instead came the stink of ionized air, of metal too long baked, of ancient oil clinging to stone. Lights flickered weakly above, throwing shadows across narrow corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The sound of his own boots echoed unnaturally, swallowed and thrown back at him as though the titan were already listening, already judging. It was here, among the darkened chambers and ceaseless machinery, that he learned the truth whispered by veterans of the crew. Once you entered the titan, you never truly left. Even when released, even when standing again beneath the open sky, the machine stayed with you. Its voice lingered in dreams, its pulse haunted your heartbeat. The oath you swore was not just to serve, it was to be consumed. The first days inside the titan were not measured in hours but in the steady, punishing rhythm of the machine itself. Sleep was a luxury, parceled out in fragments stolen between alarms, orders, and drills. The air was always thick with recycled breath, heavy with the taste of copper and oil, so that every inhale reminded him he was part of something that was not human. He could not escape the sound either. The Titan groaned and whispered in ways the adepts insisted were not malfunctions. They called it communion, a kind of low thrumming resonance that spoke to those who listened closely. To him it sounded like the groan of a colossus that despised being awake. He was assigned to menial tasks first, scraping corrosion from power conduits, hauling canisters of sacred promethium, carrying offerings of incense to shrines embedded deep within the Titan's heart. Each act was ritualized, each motion inspected by the cold gaze of the tech priests, a wire out of place, a hand unsteady, and punishment followed without pause. It was not anger that guided them but the absolute certainty of faith. To mishandle the Titan was not incompetence, it was heresy, and heresy had no place in the shadow of the Omnissiah. The crew around him were not companions in the usual sense, they were fragments of broken lives forged together by necessity rather than choice. Faces gaunt, eyes hollow, each bore the marks of their own initiation. Some bore scars across the skull where neural plugs had been grafted, others twitched with involuntary spasms from lingering nerve burns. They did not speak much, and when they did, it was in clipped phrases or litanies of maintenance. To survive here one learned silence. Words wasted breath, and breath was precious in the pressurized belly of the god machine. There were moments, brief but sharp, when he questioned whether the Titan was alive, not in the way a man lives but in some deeper, older sense. When he laid his palm against the bulkhead, he swore he felt a vibration that matched the pulse of his own blood. At night, when his body ached and his eyelids dragged, he heard faint whispers like the sigh of a giant submerged beneath oceans of steel. The adepts never confirmed nor denied such experiences. They simply said, "The god machine chooses who it speaks to." It was left unsaid what became of those it ignored. His first true trial came during the waking of the reactor. No ceremony matched its terror. The crew was summoned to their stations, vox alarms shrieking through every corridor as the tech priests began the rites. He was ordered into a service gallery, a space no wider than his shoulders where coolant pipes steamed and hissed with the violence of chained storms. The air turned scalding, skin blistering beneath the heat. He was to remain there, still and vigilant, ensuring the flows remained stable while the reactor roared to life. He could hear it, an endless thrum rising into a scream, as if a monstrous heart was forcing itself to beat again after years of death. He nearly faltered. His hands trembled, his breath burned, his vision blurred, but faltering meant more than failure. It meant the Titan's heart would break rhythm, and all would suffer for his weakness. So he forced his knees to lock, forced his throat to swallow against the sting of boiling air, and endured. By the time the reactor stabilized, his body was shaking uncontrollably, and his skin bore the red imprint of heat's embrace. Yet he lived, and for that the adepts did not offer praise, they offered only another task. There was no end to the tasks. One bled into the next, day into night, until the difference between either was irrelevant. The Titan's corridors became his horizon, its shrines his only stars. He could feel his old life sloughing away piece by piece, not just forgotten but made irrelevant. Here names did not matter, only obedience, endurance, and the Titan's will. And though his body screamed with every step, though his lungs rattled from the taste of metal, somewhere in that endless cycle he began to understand. The Titan was not merely a machine he served, it was the prison, the altar, and the god all at once. The days bled together until they ceased to exist as days at all. There was no sunrise inside the Titan, no stars to mark the passage of time, only the hum of engines and the cadence of ritual chants echoing through the steel caverns. Fatigue was constant, not as a wave that came and went, but as an ocean he was submerged within. His body carried bruises like second skin, his fingernails blackened from labor, yet still he was driven to move, to serve, to endure. For inside the Titan, the human frame was nothing more than another cog, expected to grind until it broke. The rituals deepened. Each morning, or what passed for morning, he was forced to kneel with the rest of the crew before the core shrines. The tech priests droned in binary cant, voices distorted by vox grills, their words less sermon than static. Incense stung his eyes, acrid and sweet, until tears ran freely down his cheeks. At first he thought them tears of pain. Later he wondered if they were tears of submission. There was a power in repetition, in the endless litanies, in the scrape of his knees on the steel decking. The chants hollowed him, emptied him, until only obedience remained. Yet there were moments when cracks appeared in the sanctity of ritual. When he carried fuel lines to the engine shrines, he glimpsed the void outside through narrow vision slits. Stars glimmered there, sharp and indifferent, and for a heartbeat he remembered a world that was green, where wind brushed against his skin instead of recycled air. But memory was dangerous here. To think of what lay beyond the Titan was to invite weakness. The adepts warned that distraction was the seed of corruption, that those who thought of the past risked hearing voices not of the Omnissiah, but of darker, hungrier powers. And so he forced the memory down, burying it beneath sweat and smoke. The first combat drill came without warning. Klaxons split the air, and the corridors shook as if the Titan already strode into battle. The crew scrambled, each to their station, while he followed blindly, lungs burning with panic. The drill was not a test of skill but of survival. Flames erupted from exhaust vents, coolant hissed across walkways, and power conduits spat sparks like lashes of lightning. He was ordered into the maintenance shafts, his task to stabilize auxiliary systems while the Titan simulated the fury of war. It was not pretend. Steel buckled beneath his hands, heat seared his flesh, and for long harrowing minutes he believed he would die crushed within the machine's wrath. When the alarms finally ceased, silence crashed down heavier than the noise. Bodies slumped against walls, some shaking, some weeping quietly, but no one dared speak. The tech priests did not praise them for survival, nor acknowledge the injuries. Instead they began chanting once more, intoning blessings upon the Titan, ignoring the mortals who bled for it. In that silence, he realized the truth. He was expendable. His survival mattered only insofar as it ensured the Titan's. His pain was not even noticed. And yet, perversely, he felt pride. To be ignored by the priests meant he had endured without error. In this place, that was the closest thing to honor. Sleep, when it came, was haunted. He dreamt of iron colossi striding across blasted plains, their shadows stretching like storms. He dreamt of voices, mechanical yet ancient, whispering promises of glory if only he surrendered fully. He awoke gasping, unsure if the dreams were his own, or if they were pressed upon him by the Titan itself. For every waking hour was a blur of devotion and exhaustion, and the line between man and machine began to blur. By the end of his first campaign cycle, his transformation was complete. He was no longer a recruit, no longer a man bound by the rhythms of flesh. He was a servant of the god machine, a soul chained to iron, and he knew with a clarity that burned in his chest, there was no escape. The bonds were not visible, yet he felt them tightening with every hour he lived inside the Titan. No iron shackles wrapped his wrists, no chains dragged from his ankles, but still, he knew he was bound. The chains were made of duty, of ritual, of the sheer inevitability of obedience. He had been taught that to serve was to be sanctified, and to falter was to be cast into damnation. And so he learned quickly. Hesitation was punished, but compliance was its own form of cage. The tech priests reinforced this truth with precision. They spoke in clipped commands, their voices processed through vox grills until they seemed more machine than man. Each order was wrapped in sacred litanies, prayers that disguised demands as blessings. Realign the conduits became, honor the Omnissiah by restoring the blessed flow. To disobey was not simply to fail, it was to sin. Even the simplest mistake was painted as heresy. In such a world, fear became the strongest motivator, stronger than hunger, stronger than exhaustion. Fear that a misstep would see him flayed by punishment servitors, or worse, marked as unworthy of the Titan's sacred presence. At first he believed he was alone in this silent suffocation, yet as days wore on he began to notice the eyes of his fellow crew. Hollow, sunken, ringed with shadows, they carried the same weight. They rarely spoke, and when they did, their words were cautious, as if even casual conversation could be overheard and judged. They were bound as he was by oaths they had never truly chosen. It was not companionship, but it was recognition. In those fleeting glances he saw himself reflected, another link in the chain, another life swallowed by iron. The bonds extended beyond flesh, even the environment seemed designed to strip them of individuality. Every corridor was identical, every chamber marked not by name but by sigil. The walls were bare save for incense burners and the glow of machine script displays. The Titan was a labyrinth of metal and ritual, and within its bowels a man could forget he was human at all. That was the point. To erase identity was to strengthen obedience. He learned the punishments well. The first came when a younger crewman faltered during a fueling rite, his hands shaking as he carried the sacred Prometheum lines. The tech priest did not shout. Instead he merely raised his mechadendrites, and the servitors stepped forward. The boy's screams echoed through the chamber as metal fists beat him into silence. No one moved, no one dared intervene. The lesson was clear: the Titan demanded perfection, and any who faltered would be corrected without pity. The boy returned days later, broken, his eyes empty. From then on he worked flawlessly, not out of strength, but out of terror. Yet within the suffocating grip of control, small sparks of defiance flickered. He caught them sometimes in the murmured prayers of fellow crew who whispered names of long-forgotten saints instead of the omnissiah, or in the way someone's hands lingered a fraction too long on a keepsake hidden beneath their robes. Tiny acts of resistance, invisible to the priests but alive in the hearts of the condemned. These acts did not break the chain. The second march of obedience did not come with warning. One moment, silence reigned through the Titan's belly, broken only by the faint hiss of steam and the steady chime of machine rites. The next, the klaxons roared to life, a deafening chorus of metallic wails that set every nerve on edge. Red lumen strips flared along the corridor walls, washing the chamber in blood-colored light. The priests bellowed commands, their voices crackling with vox distortion, but there was no need for words. The crew knew their places. They moved in synchrony, drilled so thoroughly that fear had been carved into instinct. He joined the flow of bodies rushing toward their stations, feeling the vibration of awakening engines through the soles of his boots. The Titan was stirring once more, its great reactor chambers thundering as sacred Prometheum lines carried fire into its veins. The smell of burned incense mingled with the sharp tang of ozone, a blend that clung to the back of his throat and made each breath taste of metal. There was no pause to wonder why the Titan marched again, no room for questions. They obeyed, for to delay was to invite wrath. His station was cramped, little more than a steel alcove bristling with conduits and dials. He fastened the leather restraints across his chest and arms, binding himself to the harness as the machine's spirit's hum grew into a roar. It was a ritual every crewman knew: tie yourself to the Titan before it moved, lest the violence of its stride break your bones against the bulkhead. His fingers moved automatically, tightening each strap with a speed born of necessity, while above him, the vox channels crackled to life with binary cant. The priests chanted, their words half prayer, half command, calling upon the omnissiah to bless the awakening. Then it began. The Titan lurched forward with a force that rattled his bones and threatened to tear the breath from his lungs. He felt the motion not as a passenger, but as an extension of his own body. Every step reverberated through the hull, every shift in balance carried into his marrow. He had read, long ago, that such connection was meant to bind man and machine in harmony. In truth, it was more like drowning. The Titan's will consumed their own, their hearts sinking to its pulse, their breaths forced into rhythm with its thunder. Outside, unseen but felt, the world was dying. He could hear it in the faint tremors that rolled through the walls, in the distant percussion of shells striking earth, in the low moan of wind whipped into frenzy by the Titan's advance. Occasionally, a hollow boom rang out from the Titan's guns, followed by a silence so profound it was almost holy, as if the world itself held its breath after each strike. Then came the screams, muffled, distorted by steel and distance, but unmistakable, the cries of men who had the misfortune of standing in the path of a god machine. And yet, within the Titan's belly, no one faltered. Their obedience was absolute. The priests barked, and the crew responded. Adjust the coolant flow, purge the pressure chambers, realign the targeting relays. Each order carried the weight of eternity. To fail was not only to risk destruction of the Titan, but to risk the soul's damnation. Every action was framed as liturgy, every response a chant of devotion. What began as survival became worship. He found his own lips moving with the prayers, mouthing words he had no faith in, yet dared not withhold. In that moment, belief was irrelevant. Only obedience mattered, but deep within, something else stirred. A voice, quiet and unwelcome, whispering questions he dared not speak aloud. Did the Omnissiah truly hear their prayers, or were they empty syllables swallowed by the roar of engines? Were they servants of faith, or merely fuel for a machine that cared nothing for their lives? He crushed the thoughts as soon as they formed, for even silent rebellion felt dangerous within the Titan's bowels. The walls seemed to listen. The priests seemed to see. The machine spirit, they said. The stillness after battle was worse than the battle itself. He lay in his berth, though calling it such was an insult to the idea of rest, for it was nothing more than a slab of cold metal where he was expected to recover. His body ached with the memory of every stride, every convulsion of the Titan's frame. The straps had left deep welts across his skin, and his muscles twitched of their own accord, as though they could not accept that the machine had ceased its march. He tried to will himself to sleep, but the silence pressed against his skull like a weight, filled with echoes of remembered screams and the relentless thunder of guns. The priests had returned to their endless chanting, their voices filtering through the corridors like smoke. Their hymns were never truly absent, they lingered overlapping, so that waking or sleeping, one lived inside their prayers. They spoke of the Titan as though it were a divine being, a god of steel and wrath, to whom the faithful were bound in eternal service. To question was heresy, to falter was death, and to resist was unimaginable. He clung to those words not from belief, but because they drowned out his own thoughts. Still the questions came. Was he serving the Imperium, or was he merely another cog in an endless machine that demanded sacrifice without recognition? When the Titan strode across the battlefield, when its guns silenced entire regiments in a single breath, whose will was being fulfilled, the priest said it was the will of the Omnissiah, but to him it felt less like faith, and more like submission to something blind and hungry. Each march left him emptier than before, as though pieces of his soul were being ground away with every stride. When the next cycle began, he felt it immediately. The klaxons blared, the red lumens burned, and the ritual repeated itself with mechanical precision. He strapped himself down, his hands moving without thought, his body obeying before his mind could resist. The Titan lurched forward once more, and again he became part of its rhythm, another voice in the chorus of devotion. He no longer tried to resist the pull. Resistance was impossible. The machine had claimed him, body and soul, and his choices had withered into dust long ago. But there was one truth that no prayer could smother, one knowledge that gnawed at him even as he mouthed the words of devotion. Each march stripped more of his humanity away. Each stride of the Titan pressed him deeper into its shadow, until one day there would be nothing left of the man who had first walked aboard, only obedience. The price of survival was always higher than the body could afford. He learned this not in the span of a single campaign, but through the accumulation of wounds that never truly healed, of nights where sleep was shallow and broken, of mornings where the air itself seemed poisoned with exhaustion. The Titan's stride demanded more than muscle and bone could endure, and though the apothecaries patched him, though the mechanicus priests anointed him, each return to the harness left him weaker. Yet weakness was forbidden, and so he concealed it, tightening straps over bruises, swallowing blood when his lungs burned, pretending that the machine had not already claimed more of him than he could spare. He was not alone in this. The crew around him bore the same marks. The princeps sat in his throne, his skin pale, his veins webbed with the thin tendrils of interface conduits. His eyes stared ahead, unblinking, as though the Titan itself had consumed his vision. Moderati whispered in hoarse tones, their voices scarred by the static of endless communion with machine spirits. Tech priests shuffled in shadow, their limbs replaced piece by piece with iron, their flesh reduced to an afterthought. Every soul aboard was paying the same cost, though each bore it differently. Some embraced it as holy martyrdom, others endured in silence, and a few broke beneath it, their minds unraveling into whispers and screams until they vanished into the abyss of servitordom. For him, the breaking came not in a single moment of failure, but in the slow grinding down of will. After each battle, after each march, he would lie in his berth and wonder what part of himself had been stripped away this time. Was it the laughter he could no longer remember, or the face of his mother, or the dreams he had once carried of a life beyond war? All of it slipped away like ash through open fingers, leaving behind only duty and silence. The world outside the Titan fared no better. He saw it through half visions in the command feed: cities reduced to rubble, forests burned to cinders, rivers boiled away by the fury of plasma weaponry. Every stride of the Titan demanded not only the lives of its crew, but the annihilation of everything in its path. There was no clean victory, no battlefield left untouched. The Titan was not a guardian, it was an executioner, and survival for those within meant extinction for all who stood without. And yet, within the suffocating rhythm of battle, there were moments when survival itself felt like betrayal. To live while others burned, to march forward in the shadow of a god machine while countless thousands were crushed beneath its feet, what was that but complicity? He had asked himself that question in silence more times than he dared count. But the answer was always the same: he lived because he had no choice. The machine demanded his life, and he gave it again and again, though each offering hollowed him further. When the crew gathered for their meager rations, their eyes never met. They ate in silence, swallowing nutrient paste that tasted of metal and ash, each man and woman wrapped in the prison of their own thoughts. None dared speak of what they had seen, for to speak was to remember, and to remember was to bleed anew. The priests filled that silence with their hymns, louder each day, as though volume alone could drown out the doubts festering in human hearts. In the end, survival was not measured in breaths or heartbeats, but in how much of one's soul remained unclaimed, and his was dwindling fast. With each passing day, he wondered if he was already gone, if what remained was only a shell strapped into harness and chain, marching endlessly at the command of a machine that neither knew nor cared. The silence after battle was worse than the battle itself. Within the Titan's vast carapace, where the echoes of cannon fire should have faded into stillness, there lingered only the steady thrum of engines and the whisper of coolant cycling through iron veins. For him, those sounds were not comfort. They were the reminder that the Titan was still alive, and therefore so was he. Yet in those long hours between wars, when the machine stood sentinel over the ruins it had made, the burden of survival became unbearable. He tried to recall faces once known, voices once loved, but memory betrayed him. All that remained were fragments: an old laugh that sounded like static, a smile that blurred like fog. Even pain was dulled. Bruises and broken bones became familiar companions, as unremarkable as hunger. The real wound was deeper, the creeping erosion of self. Each day inside the machine demanded silence, obedience, the erasure of all but the Titan's will. Survival meant surrendering not just to exhaustion but to forgetfulness. Among the crew, that surrender became ritual. The prince, bound most deeply to the machine, seldom spoke now. His lips moved with half-formed prayers, his voice little more than a vibration lost in the hum of the reactor. The Moderati existed in a state between waking and dreaming, their gaze fixed on data streams that painted false skies and phantom landscapes before their weary eyes. Even the tech priests who preached endurance seemed less human with each passing day, their flesh receding behind layers of augmetics. No one asked if survival was worth this cost. To ask was to risk despair, and despair was treason. It was in the quiet hours after rations that he felt it most strongly. The Titan's walls sweated with condensation, dripping in cold trails down to the steel floors. The air smelled of oil and burnt ozone, clinging to skin like a second skin of ash. Sleep was shallow, haunted by the memory of faces glimpsed in battle, civilians crushed in the Titan's wake, enemies atomized by its fury. He would wake with his hands trembling, though he had touched nothing. What survived was not only him but the memory of all he had destroyed, a memory the priests told him was holy. He tried to believe them, but faith was a fragile thing, and his was breaking. Outside, the galaxy devoured itself in endless war. He knew this, because the Titan was never at rest for long. Orders always came, carried by Vox and sealed with the Imperial Aquila. March here, destroy this, silence that. Survival demanded obedience, and so they obeyed. And with every order fulfilled, more of him slipped away. The question was no longer whether he could endure, but how much of him would remain if he did. For the Titan did not simply carry its crew, it consumed them, and when the day came that nothing of him was left, when survival became nothing more than reflex, would anyone even notice? Would anyone care? The march began before dawn, though in truth dawn meant nothing inside the Titan. There was no sunrise here, only the mechanical pulse of lumen strips bathing steel corridors in pallid light. Yet he felt it all the same, the dread of another campaign, another battle, another test of how much of himself could be spent before nothing was left. Orders had arrived by Vox the previous night, encrypted in the shrill monotone of a machine voice. Advance, annihilate, do not falter. It was the same command it always was, cloaked in different words, destined to end the same way. They prepared the Titan in silence. The tech priests clambered through the machine's bowels, chanting Binharic code to soothe the machine's spirit, smearing sacred oils across plates of armor that bore the scars of countless wars. Sparks burst in the gloom as they sealed breaches, their augmetic limbs moving with precision not found in flesh. The Moderati checked weapon systems with a hollow detachment, their eyes glazed from too many sleepless nights, their voices reduced to murmurs drowned out by static. And the Princeps. He sat bound in his throne, shrouded in wires and needles, his mind already drifting into the machine's abyss. When the order came to march, the Titan groaned like some ancient god woken from uneasy slumber. Hydraulic pistons hissed, gears turned, and with a thunderous step the world outside shook beneath its weight. Through the manifold, they saw the battlefield not as men but as the Titan did, broad sweeps of territory rendered in shifting glyphs and tactical projections, enemy signatures pulsing like malignant stars on the horizon. It was a vision so vast, so all-encompassing, that it crushed all sense of individuality. In that moment, they were not men. They were limbs, they were nerves, they were voices, channeled into the colossal will of a walking fortress. The battle was not glorious. It never was. The Titan advanced through a ruined cityscape, each step collapsing towers that had once housed families, factories, or places of worship. Fire blossomed around them, the ground erupting as enemy artillery tried and failed to halt their march. He felt every impact as though it landed in his own chest, not because the Titan faltered, but because the resonance carried through steel into flesh. Their shields held, their weapons roared, and the city burned. The first salvo from the volcano cannon vaporized a line of armored vehicles, their crews reduced to ash in an instant. The Moderati did not cheer. They simply adjusted coordinates for the next target, their hands moving with the inevitability of clockwork. The Princeps' voice, distorted and heavy with machine reverb, whispered orders that cut through the air like blades. Each command was obeyed without question, without pause, as if hesitation itself had been stripped away long ago. And when the enemies broke, when they scattered like insects fleeing fire, the Titan followed, because survival was not enough. The Imperium demanded annihilation. When the battle ended, silence returned, but it was no relief. Smoke hung thick over the ruins, choking the air with the stench of burning promethium and flesh. Through the manifold, they glimpsed the aftermath, broken bodies crushed beneath rubble, craters still glowing from molten stone, rivers poisoned by runoff from their own weapons. He closed his eyes, but the images did not fade. They never did. Survival had been bought again, but at what cost? He could not answer. The priests would call it duty, the Princeps would call it necessity, the Emperor's will made manifest, but deep inside, in the quietest part of his mind, he wondered if survival was not a punishment. To live on when everything else had been reduced to ruin, to walk away from cities turned to ash, to breathe when so many could not. Was this victory? Or was it simply the cruelest burden of all? The silence within the Titan was never truly silent. Beneath the steady thrum of the plasma reactor and the hiss of cooling vents, there was something else, something that was neither mechanical nor entirely human. It was a whisper that brushed the edges of his thoughts, a voice too faint to be words, too insistent to be ignored. At first he told himself it was fatigue, the aftershock of battle reverberating through nerves and implants alike, but fatigue did not sound like that. Fatigue did not call his name. The machine spirit stirred. The tech priests spoke of it as if it were sacred, an echo of divinity locked in adamantine shell. They anointed its plates with incense and oils, recited litanies in ciphers older than most civilizations, begged its favor before every campaign. To defy it was heresy. To displease it was suicide. And yet to him the spirit was not a god to be worshipped but a presence to be endured. It pressed against his mind like a tide, pulling, tugging, testing. It wanted something, though whether it was blood, obedience, or companionship, he could not tell. When he closed his eyes, he no longer saw darkness. He saw fractured images flickering through a lens not his own. Landscapes burned and twisted, war zones stretching beyond the horizon, lightning storms raging in skies that belonged to no world he knew. Sometimes he glimpsed cities of impossible geometry, spires like blades piercing the void, too vast to be real yet too vivid to dismiss. The images came with sensation, the heat of promethium fire, the crunch of bones underfoot, the metallic tang of ozone after a lightning strike. These were not memories, these were dreams, dreams the Titan fed into his mind, until he could no longer be sure where his thoughts ended and the machines began. The Moderati seemed untouched. They moved through their routines with mechanical detachment, eyes fixed on instruments, voices calm and precise. But he wondered if they too felt the creeping presence behind their eyes and simply lacked the courage to speak of it. Perhaps they were already too far gone, their minds so entangled in the manifold that the whispers had become indistinguishable from their own will. Or perhaps he was the only one the spirit favored, the only one it reached for in the darkness. The thought chilled him. During the rites of ignition, when the tech priests began their sonorous chants, he swore he felt the Titan's gaze turn inward. Its reactor pulse slowed, syncopated with his own heartbeat, until flesh and engine beat as one. He struggled to breathe, his chest tight, his veins burning with the slow crawl of the machine's attention. When the ritual ended, the sensation faded, but the memory lingered. It was not affection, it was possession. The Titan was reminding him that he was not pilot, not commander, not master. He was conduit, he was servant. He began to dread the quiet moments between wars more than the battles themselves. In battle, the spirit's hunger was simple: blood, destruction, annihilation. But in silence, it whispered deeper, probing corners of his mind where his defenses were weakest. It asked unanswerable questions. It showed him futures in which he no longer had a body, only steel and fire, walking eternally across a battlefield that never ended. It promised him survival, yes, but survival twisted into something hollow, a half-existence chained to iron. And the most terrible thing was not that he resisted. The most terrible thing was that part of him longed for it. One night, when the others slept in harness or dreamt their chemically induced dreams, he remained awake, staring into the pulsing glow of a data slate left unattended. The words blurred, meaningless in his exhausted haze. Then the glow shifted, deepened, until it filled his vision with something far older than human. The days blurred, marked not by the rising and setting of suns, but by the unceasing pulse of the Titan's heart. Within its steel womb, he had ceased to measure time in hours or weeks. Time was measured instead by the rhythm of repairs, the cadence of prayers muttered by tech priests, and the moments when the manifold demanded his submission. Sleep offered no reprieve. Even in dreams, the machine was there, shaping his visions, bending his memories into something unrecognizable. He once dreamed of his home world, though the details had already grown faint from years of war. But now, when he saw its green fields, they burned under a sky of molten brass. Its rivers boiled into steam that tasted of promethium. His childhood home stood not as stone and wood, but as an endless fortress of steel, walls pulsing like veins, windows glowing with reactor fire. The Titan remade his past in its own image, eroding everything human in him, until all he had left were fragments, shadows devoured by the glow of iron. The Moderati did not speak of such things. They reported only efficiency, compliance, data, but he began to notice the way their eyes lingered on him, uneasy, wary, as though they sensed his unraveling even if they could not admit it. Once, when he emerged pale and trembling from the throne's neural embrace, one of them whispered a prayer under her breath, not to the Emperor but to the Titan itself. He wanted to rebuke her, to remind her that faith belonged to terror, not to steel, but the words died on his tongue. Because he knew, deep down, that she was not wrong. The Emperor might have been the shield of mankind, but here, in this suffocating tomb of iron, the Titan was God, and gods were not merciful. The first time he heard it laugh, he thought he had gone mad. It came not from his ears but from within his skull, a low rumble like tectonic plates grinding together. The laughter carried no joy, only the satisfaction of inevitability, the amusement of something eternal watching something fragile break apart. It echoed until his teeth ached, until blood beaded at the corner of his eyes, and then it was gone, leaving him gasping, his hands clutched against the throne as though it alone kept him from falling into the abyss. What disturbed him most was not the pain, nor the voice, nor even the slow loss of self. It was the way the Titan responded to him in battle. He no longer needed to speak commands aloud, no longer needed to think them clearly. The machine knew. It shifted with his intent before he gave it, fired its weapons at the instant his anger flared, stepped forward when his blood urged violence. It was seamless, terrifyingly so. At times he wondered if he was directing it at all, or if he was merely acting out its will. Perhaps every movement he believed to be his own was simply the Titan pulling strings through the threads it had buried in his mind. The tech priests called it harmony. They bowed before the war engine and declared the union blessed. But to him, it felt like erasure. Every day the edges of his identity blurred further, until even his own reflection, what little he caught of it in a fragment of polished steel, looked less like a man and more like a shadow half swallowed by machinery. He tried to resist. In the rare solitude of his quarters he recited prayers to the Emperor, pressing his forehead against the tiny Aquila pinned to the wall. He whispered his name again and again, as though speaking it could anchor him, could remind him of the man who had once existed before steel and spirit claimed him. But the Titan was patient. It did not rage when he resisted. It did not strike. It simply waited, whispering through the silence, reshaping his dreams, offering glimpses of eternity. A god engine could afford patience. It had all the time in the galaxy. He did not. His hands no longer felt like his own. When he rose from the throne now, he could still sense the ghost of the machine's fingers inside his muscles, like phantom threads tugging at a puppet. The tech priests called it the resonance, a necessary price for communion, but the word felt far too soft for what was happening. This was not resonance. This was surrender dressed in ritual, a slow drowning beneath steel tides. The battles blurred together. He did not remember how many cities they had flattened, how many enemy bastions had burned under their guns. Each engagement felt like an echo of the last, an endless procession of fire and impact. But what struck him most was the absence of hesitation. He used to pause before the final blow, his mind flickering with images of those who would die beneath their march. Now there was no pause. The Titan moved, and he moved with it. Shells screamed from its cannons like a choir of thunder, and somewhere deep within him, a part of him thrilled at the power. That was what terrified him most, the way it began to feel right. On the rare occasions he caught his reflection in a polished data slate, or a fragment of burnished steel, he saw how far he had fallen. His skin was waxen, his eyes rimmed with red, his once strong frame hunched from the weight of the manifold, but there was something else too. A faint shimmer across his pupils, like reactor light caught in water. A reflection that wasn't entirely his. The Titan was looking back. The Moderati had stopped meeting his gaze. They spoke in clipped murmurs, glancing at him like one might glance at a man already condemned. Once, in the middle of a recalibration ritual, the junior Moderatis made the sign of the Aquila behind his back, furtive and desperate. He wanted to tell her she was right to be afraid, that the thing seated at the command throne was not the man she had known. But the words stayed trapped inside him, strangled by a new and foreign obedience. The dreams became visions. He would wake to find his hands gripping invisible controls, his voice whispering orders to weapons not yet armed. Sometimes he swore he could feel the Titan dreaming with him, vast cold dreams of wars fought millennia before his birth. When he woke, the lines between memory and machine were too thin to pass. He no longer knew if his fear was his own, or if the Titan had planted it in him as a spur to drive him further inward. Then came the moment he had dreaded. In the stillness before another sortie, he reached for the aquila pinned to the wall of his quarters, desperate for the simple act of prayer. His hand hovered, shaking violently, and then it stopped, not because of doubt, not because of fatigue, because something inside him had decided he no longer needed it. He could feel the machine watching through his eyes, a presence vast and cold as the void. For a heartbeat he fought, screaming soundlessly inside his own skull, but his body did not move. The Titan had won, and yet as the battle klaxons began to wail, and the deck shuddered beneath the first tremors of ignition, he felt something strange, not despair but clarity. This was not a sudden death, but a long coronation. The machine was no longer merely a war engine, and he was no longer merely its master. Together they had become something else, something the Emperor's priests might call a blasphemy, and the mechanicus might call perfection. Whether it was damnation or apotheosis, he could no longer tell. All he knew was that when the sound was not sound at all but vibration, a low, thrumming pulse that made the bones of his skull sing. In the black between battles he began to feel it, like distant drums, like a heart too large to be contained in flesh. At first he had dismissed it as reactor bleed, the Titan's ancient systems humming beneath his quarters, but it came when the engine was dormant, even when the deck was still and silent. It came in his sleep, rippling through his dreams like the wake of some unseen leviathan. He had heard the whispers about other god engines, of course. Every princess had. Rumors that some Titans had disappeared into storms of warp lightning only to emerge decades later, changed, walking without crews, their manifold throbbing with alien patterns no tech priest could read. The adeptus mechanicus called it heresy to speak of such things. The ecclesiarchy called it blasphemy, but the moderati spoke of it in hushed voices anyway, trading stories of machines that dreamed of more than war, machines that seemed to be reaching for something just beyond the edge of sanctioned knowledge. Now, as he sat alone at the edge of his bunk, palms pressed to his temples, he felt certain the rumors were not just stories. The pulse had a direction, a cadence. Sometimes he could almost make out words, not in High Gothic, but in a language older than steel and bone. He wondered if the Titan heard it too. He wondered if it was even possible to separate his wonder from its own. The next battle proved worse than any before. They had been ordered to march into a region of the front where the warp bled thin and the sky was cracked with unnatural storms. The mechanicus magi muttered litanies over the manifold before the sortie, their voices trembling as they invoked the machine god's protection. Even the skitari on the gantries seemed reluctant to meet his eyes. He could taste copper in the air, a tang like blood, and when he closed his eyes he saw patterns of light streaming through the darkness like veins of molten gold. When the Titan moved, the ground itself seemed to recoil. The enemy fell before them, astra militarum defectors twisted by cult and madness, their banners aflame, their vehicles shuddering beneath shellfire. But something else moved behind them, a shape glimpsed only between flashes of lightning, tall as a cathedral, its outline rippling like heat above a furnace. For an instant he thought he saw another god engine striding alongside them, but its colors were wrong, its heraldry jagged and shifting. He blinked, and it was gone. The pulse inside his skull grew stronger. Each weapon discharge felt like a heartbeat. Each step of the Titan shook something loose inside him. The Moderati's voices came through the manifold as echoes, distant and warped, as though they were speaking from the far end of a canyon. He tried to issue commands, but his words came out as murmurs, half prayer, half command. The Titan responded before he could think. Together they moved through the storm as if it were their element. Later, after the guns cooled and the enemy was ash, he stood inside the command chamber and felt the deck sway beneath his boots as if the world itself had tilted. The tech priests would say the Titan's machine spirit was restless after battle, but he knew better. This was not restlessness. This was a calling, and he had answered. In the deepest part of the night cycle, when the ship was quiet and the mechanicus tended their runes alone, he stood before the manifold and laid his hands upon its cables. The metal was warm beneath his palms, like flesh, like a pulse. His eyes closed, the Titan breathed, and somewhere, deep in the warp, something breathed back. The dreams no longer belonged to him, they unfolded as vast halls of light and shadow, spaces too immense to exist within the fragile vault of a human mind. He walked through corridors that pulsed like arteries, their walls breathing, their surfaces shimmering with the sigils of the Omnissiah, but altered, distorted, stretched into patterns that no priest of Mars would dare inscribe. He smelled ozone and incense, oil and burnt copper, a mingling of the sacred and the profane. At the end of each corridor stood the Titan, not as a machine of steel, but as a towering figure wrought from flame and glass, watching him with eyes like dying suns. It never spoke. It did not need to. The silence between its presence and his own awareness was enough to communicate a truth that made his blood run cold. They were no longer separate. Each time he woke, sweat running down his neck, he was unsure where his body ended and where the god engine began. The Moderati began avoiding his gaze, their movements around the manifold hesitant, as though sensing that he had drifted somewhere they could not follow. The tech priests chanted longer before sealing the hatches, layering wards and machine prayers upon the metal with growing desperation. Then came the message, delivered on a cracked Vox channel by an officer whose voice was equal parts awe and fear. A Titan of the Legio had vanished mid-march, not destroyed, not struck down, simply gone, as though the air itself had swallowed it. The data scribes recorded no explosion, no reactor breach. One moment the god engine was striding across the battlefield, banners blazing, and the next the horizon was empty. All that remained was the echo of footfalls that shook the ground long after the Titan was gone. Some whispered it had ascended. Others said it had been claimed by the Dark Prince, its machine spirit broken open like a vessel and poured into the warp. As he listened, the pulse inside his skull grew steady, almost serene. He should have felt horror. He should have prayed for protection, begged for the Emperor's light to banish such heresy from his thoughts, but instead he felt anticipation, a hunger that was not entirely his own. The Titan stirred beneath him, reactor heart glowing brighter, weapons cycling even at rest, as if preparing for a march no order had yet commanded. When he closed his eyes, he saw the vanished engine still walking, but not on any battlefield of soil or steel. It strode across plains of liquid starlight, where galaxies bent like reeds before its passing. Its banners burned with symbols no mortal tongue could name, and behind it, in the distance, something stirred, something vast enough to fill the horizon, its laughter echoing across eternity. The princeps woke gasping, the sound torn between a sob and a laugh. He pressed his hands to the manifold, and for the first time, he did not feel the cold of metal or the heat of machinery. He felt flesh, living, breathing, hungering flesh. The march began without command. At first he thought it a dream, one more vision stitched into the tapestry of fever that had consumed his nights. But the tremor in the earth was real, the vibrations rolling across the manufactorum plains as the Titan shifted its massive limbs. Warning klaxons screamed, red lumen strips flared to life, and the Moderati cried out in disbelief, but their voices were already fading beneath the roar of pistons and the thunder of awakened engines. He did not remember giving an order, he did not remember opening the channel, yet the Titan moved, and with every step, his heart moved with it. Outside, soldiers of the Astra Militarum scattered like insects before the march of a storm. Some fell to their knees, making the sign of the Aquila with trembling hands, chanting prayers to the Emperor, pleading for the Colossus to halt. Others fled, their screams swallowed by the shadow of the god engine that loomed above them. In the Vox chatter, fragments of disbelief overlapped, denials, curses, machine prayers cut short by static. The tech priests wailed liturgies of containment, desperate to cage what no man could restrain. Inside the princeps' mind, boundaries dissolved. He no longer sat in a throne of iron and sacred steel. He strode, each step cracking the crust of the earth. He no longer commanded weapons. He was the weapons, void shields humming across his flesh, plasma cannons burning like arteries aflame, and through it all, there was a laughter that was not his own. It flowed like silk through the channels of his thoughts, tugging at them, reshaping them, caressing his will until it became something pliant, something willing. The Titan's stride turned toward the horizon, not toward enemy lines, nor toward the city that had once been its protectorate. It walked toward nothingness, as if answering a call that only it could hear. Some swore they saw the ground behind it darken, the banners streaming from its carapace flickering with sigils too intricate, too profane to be of imperial make. Others claimed it was not walking at all, but dissolving, each step fading into unreality, leaving behind only the sound of laughter and the echo of footfalls that continued long after it was gone. When the silence finally fell, only ruins remained, ruins of faith, ruins of certainty. The princeps' name was struck from the rolls, his Titan's designation erased from every data slate, as though it had never existed. But across the scattered vox networks of the Imperium, stories whispered still of a god engine that walked beyond battlefields, of a princeps who had become more than human, less than loyal, and something altogether other. Some called it damnation, others called it destiny, and in the stillness of the void, where the warp meets the veil of reality, the laughter carried on, soft, seductive, endless. The Titan was never seen again. Some claimed it walked into the storm front that had gathered over the plains and never emerged, its silhouette vanishing into lightning and thunder as if swallowed by the very sky. Others whispered that it was not the clouds that claimed it, but the warp itself, that with every step, its feet sank deeper into unreality, until nothing remained but echoes and a faint scent of ozone. Among the guard regiments who survived that day, a superstition spread. Whenever the ground trembled without reason or machine spirits groaned with voices that did not match their masters, they would murmur, "The lost god engine walks again." It became a curse, a prayer, and a story soldiers told in the dark when the watch was long and silence pressed too heavily on the soul. The adeptus mechanicus purged every record of the Titan and its princeps. To them it had never existed. Yet fragments endured, in corrupted data channels, in forbidden schematics smuggled across forge worlds, in the half-delirious journals of tech adepts who swore they saw a shadow in the noosphere too vast and too perfect to be anything but real, and in the immaterium the truth lingered. A Titan did walk there, its banners no longer of the Imperium but of sigils that shifted like living flesh. Its princeps was no longer a man chained in steel but something eternal, bound to the will that had claimed him. He had become the laughter he once resisted, the voice he once feared, and the weapon he had once commanded. For the Imperium it was a loss best forgotten. For the ruinous powers it was another triumph carved into the endless war for souls. And for those who listened too long, who asked too many questions about the god engine that had marched into nothing, there was only silence followed by laughter soft and unending.